Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I'm John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. Good topic, let's do it. What's the strangest thing that's happened to you outdoors without an explanation? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Old man is a ham radio operator, so it wasn't weird for the kids in my family to be in the ham shack downstairs chatting with someone on the other side of the world or aboard one of the space stations. Back in the 90s, my brother and I got the opportunity to chat with a cosmonaut on the Mir space station, pre-ISS, because it was going to fly directly over our house. We ran outside to see if we could spot the marker lights. Once we did, Dad radioed the cosmonaut that we saw him and his position to us. The cosmonaut replied back that it was the wrong angle, that he should have been directly overhead. So we looked and there he was, which made my family wonder what we were looking at before. We spotted it again and radioed its position to the cosmonaut. Next thing we know, the light we were looking at disappeared, as if someone shut it off. We radioed the cosmonaut what we just saw. We never heard from the Mir station again that night. Deep in the woods, my hiking partner and I were many miles from any trail, path, or hint of human development when we came across a two-seater outhouse surrounded by dense overgrowth and trees. This outhouse was well maintained, painted, and supplied with toilet paper and magazines. Even screens on the window vents were in excellent condition. The ground around it showed no signs of human activity, yet there it was, miles from civilization and no paths or trails leading to it. As we sat there, not at the same time, putting it to good use, we wondered how whoever built it managed to get all the building materials, tools, and equipment to such a remote location surrounded by a thick canopy of trees and overgrowth, and why they would do it in the first place. This has a definite explanation, but still weird and scary. For a while I was getting into nighttime photography, like taking landscape photos with the starry sky. There's a highway in Washington that leads to a really cool observatory of Mount St. Helens. So one November night, I drove out there at like 10 p.m. We walked around and took pictures till about 2 a.m. Leaving the observatory, you drive down this winding hill that eventually takes you back to the state highway. It's dark, I'm tired, and start driving down the hill. I found a corner and there's a bull elk standing in the middle of the road staring at my car. I'm going slow enough, so I stop with plenty of distance between myself and the elk, and it's staring at me. Its family crosses the road behind it, so okay, he's just protecting his family from traffic. He makes his way to the shoulder of the road and appears to start walking away. I start driving again, but this time like really slow, because seeing him startled me, and now I'm tired and alert and out in the woods. I pass the elk and bring my speed up to about 25. Both hands on the wheel, brights on, window rolled down. All of a sudden, this elk is side by side with my car, keeping pace and chasing me. It freaked me out, so I sped up a little bit and it still kept up. It chased me all the way down the hill, which seemed like a mile, but maybe a little shorter. And then he finally peeled off and disappeared. My best explanation is maybe my car was threatening to its family, and so he had to be a tough guy and chase me away. But the initial panic of seeing him in my headlights and then calming down and then being blindsided by him chasing my car was enough to give me the jitters for my entire 2-hour drive home. I think you could probably write this off to just a territorial moose, right? It's his road. When I was around 2, I was sat in my high chair, as I did every day, probably eating something, when my mother left the room. She came back to see me standing in my high chair, looking out the window and waving. She quickly told me to sit down and ask who I was waving at, and I just replied, "Man in window." Everyone thought it was my imagination, and came to the conclusion it was the guy from the Barney who I had a weird obsession with. This happened a few times throughout a few weeks, and no one really took any notice, until one day. My mother and grandmother were getting our family albums to organize and look at. I guess I picked up a photo, and my mother recalls that I said "man in window" whilst pointing at the picture. The man in the picture was my mother's father. He died under unexpected circumstances very young. I kept on repeating "man in window." My grandmother grew upset and had to leave the room. My mother then sat my high chair closer and in better view of the window, as she believed that my grandfather was checking up on me. and how she wished he lived to see his grandchildren as when he was alive. He longed the day he would see them. I woke up out of nowhere and had a bad feeling. I called home and woke my parents up, wanting to speak to my mother. All of a sudden, my father couldn't wake her and had to call me back. She had stopped breathing seconds before, and my father was able to start CPR and call 911. To this day, I can't explain why I had that feeling, but she's safe and well. I got two that I can't explain, and I'll give you one from my sister because her story is better. So, the first one of mine is when I was driving home after work. It was after the sun had set, but you could still see the light coming from behind the mountains. I look over and see a perfectly round orb hanging above the mountaintops. It was not the sun. I had no issues looking at it. It was like someone had put their finger in yellow paint and made a dot in the sky. It wasn't even giving off its own light. I'm watching this as I drive home, turn a corner, look back, it's gone. I kick myself every time I think I should have pulled over to watch it. The second one, I was sitting on my back porch with one of my friends just watching the sky, and off to our left we see a bright star had been there the entire time we were outside start moving and drifting off into the black. I asked my friend, "Did you see that star drift off?" He said, "Yep," and we have never talked about it since. Now, the last from my sister, she was out camping with her then boyfriend. She said they were laying down without a tent, and out of nowhere the biggest moon she'd ever seen popped out of nowhere. She turned to talk to her boyfriend, and he was already asleep. The next thing she remembers was watching the numbers on the clock in her car start going faster and faster. After that, all she remembers was waking up outside the next day, and when she went to leave from the campsite, the clock in her car wasn't the right time anymore. I used to work for the United States government assisting farms and farm workers around the country. I often worked in very remote areas of the country and had some strange encounters. There's one, however, that really stands out. The first one occurred while I was working in the southeastern United States. A coworker and I were winding our way through the Appalachian Mountains, checking in on various tobacco and tomato farms deep in the mountains. While trying to find our way to an especially remote farm, we turned down the wrong dirt road and got lost. We were miles from the nearest city, and we found ourselves surrounded by a dense forest and mountains towering above us, blocking any cell service. We tried to turn around, but the road was too narrow. We had to keep driving until the road widened a bit more, and we could turn the car around. After a few minutes of driving into the woods, we stumbled upon a clearing wide enough to let us turn the car around. As we approached, we noticed the ruins of an old house in the middle of the clearing. The house had burned down and looked like it could barely stand. The ground around the house was still charred from the fire, but the surrounding trees and forest were fine. We parked the car on the edge of the clearing and got out to have a closer look. As we approached, my coworker and I stopped simultaneously in our tracks. We both realized at that moment that the ground around the house had been burned in a perfect circle, with the house in the exact center. Something didn't feel right. My coworker and I looked at each other as if we were looking for the other person to acknowledge how strange the situation was, but we kept walking toward the house. The moment we stepped foot into the burned circle, all of the ambient noise of the forest stopped and went dead silent. All the bugs, the birds chirping, the wind whipping through the trees, the sound of the grass swaying back and forth, all of it stopped. It was as if someone had secretly slipped noise-canceling headphones onto my coworker and me. We again stopped walking to check to see if we were hearing things right, and that's when the noise began. It was a booming, rumbling noise echoing in the sky. It sounded like the loudest, deepest trumpet you could ever hear. It was so loud it hurt our ears. I could feel the noise rattling in my eardrum. It was constant. It didn't change pitch. It didn't stop or take a break. A cold chill ran down my spine, and every part of me felt like something was very, very wrong. We looked at the sky and looked around to try to see what could be making the noise, but there was nothing. There were no clouds in the sky, and we were all alone. Meanwhile, the noise kept going, and the feeling that something was wrong only grew stronger. My coworker and I both turned around and ran back to our car as fast as we could. The moment we stepped outside of the burn circle on the ground, the booming noise stopped, and the normal sounds of the forest returned. We could hear the birds again. We could hear the wind and the leaves on the trees. We jumped into the car and drove out of the woods in silence. We didn't turn the radio on or say a word until we returned to our hotel. When we parked, my coworker just looked at me and said, "That happened, right?" To this day, I can't explain that house, what the noise we heard was, or why. We could only hear it when we stepped into the circle. Not sure if you're hearing this, but if you are, where was this? Sounds wild. I used to live next to a small graveyard in Moorhead, Kentucky, about 7 miles from town, middle of nowhere type stuff. 11605 Cranston Road, Moorhead, Kentucky. I've experienced a lot of shit there, but the experience that changed me was this. I was outside a little over midnight listening to music and just having a good time. I stopped to look around at the sky and appreciate what was around me then. I looked across the field, probably almost a little under an acre, at the neighbor's house across the way because I saw movement. So I said to myself, why is our neighbor out so late with a flashlight? And before I could finish that thought, the bulb of light I assumed was a flashlight flew in my direction across our field and landed on my arm, then disappeared. It legit looked like it was a flashlight, but when it flew toward me in half of a second and made my arm numb, then disappeared, I froze. 15 seconds later, I ran inside, sat on the couch next to my mom, and didn't say anything about it till the next day. One night after a hard day with the kids, my husband and I turned the TV off around 10 p.m. to go to bed, and I said to my hubby, listen to that peace and quiet. It was summer, so all the windows were open. We went to bed, and around 12 a.m. I was woken up by the sound of music blaring. I went back off to sleep and woke again around 2 a.m. with music blaring again. I got up to look outside to see where the party was, but there was only streetlights on. I realized the music was coming from my car. The driveway was in front of our bedroom window, so if it had been left on, we would have heard it when we went to bed. It was very strange. My husband, who isn't the type to make things up, said he was driving the same car and had music on and was singing away, and he suddenly heard someone clapping in the back seat. He drove home pretty quick after that. It's possible for a car to be haunted. This happened in the 90s, and the car was a 1970s Holden Gemini, so it was pretty old. A few years back, I woke up in the middle of the night and checked my phone. It was 3 a.m. The power was out. I grabbed my phone for a flashlight and went on the porch to smoke a cigarette. My roommate had just woken up randomly too, at the same time as me. We go out to smoke and it's so dark and quiet, like eerily dark and quiet. No sound at all other than the two of us. The wind wasn't even blowing. No light except the moon. We are freaked out. We just smoke our cigarettes and all of a sudden the streetlights pop on. We hear cicadas and the sounds of cars on the highway. Everything was back to normal. It's like for that 10 minutes we randomly woke up at the same time. The whole world was paused. Maybe not supernatural, but I used to work at Walgreens. On an average day, working in the cash register, I see a tall black skinny man walk towards me. His back was bent back, walking like a creature from a B movie. His eyes were bloodshot red. He had no teeth. He was wearing pants as a shirt, a rag covering his genitals, barefoot and smelling like shit. We never deny service to homeless people, but this was something else. He brings up a 4-pack of Natty Ice to the counter. His hands were crazy twisted. I scan the beers and put them in the bag. I tell him, "That's $3.49, sir," and proceeds to shout at me and starts waving his hands trying to reach his back. His screech sounded like he was in agony. He reaches back to his ass and pulls out a $5 bill covered in shit. In shit. This is important later. I act as politely as I can, take the bill, and before I can give him his change, he runs away with his 4-pack. I can't find a reason for him to run away. I was literally going to give him his change. But as soon as he walks out, he opens one of the beers and downs it in 2 chugs, and the next one as well, and the next one, and the last one. He proceeds to scream and run around outside the store, harassing customers. I call my manager and he calls the cops. Walks outside, meanwhile, to scare the poor guy away. The guy proceeds to take his shirt off and starts banging it on the floor, shouting. Moments later, the cops show up and try to cuff him up. He obviously resisted. To say it was brutal would be an understatement. He got shoved in the back of the cop car and started screeching like a mating cat. He was not having it. He was a true warrior, but seconds before finally getting the door closed, he gives me the dirtiest look I've ever gotten. A look that said, This is your fault. I will find you." All of this happened while Party in the USA by Miley Cyrus was playing in the background. Fast forward. I asked the manager what to do with the bill. He says, "Money's money. Keep it in the register." The stench was awful, both for me and the customers. I decided I had enough and handed it as change to a cool dude who had no problem with it. The next day, a customer pays me with the same bill. I tried so many times to get rid of the bill, but it always kept coming back. Always. One day, I said F it, and just took it and threw it in a trash compressor, never to be seen again. I swear his screech still haunts me to this day 2 years later. I can't explain it. This is what happens in South Florida. You read some of these stories and you're like, boy, this really sounds like Florida, but you don't want to make that assumption. And then they say it, so. Before I became too severely disabled, I'd take a 2-week solo camping trip out in the middle of the woods in West Virginia. I had my cell phone on me, and I'd check in each day with some people, as I wasn't suicidal, but I really enjoy the solitude. The last time I did this, I got a really uneasy feeling the first day. I just brushed it off as soon as some anxiety due to being in a bit of pain. It just didn't let up as I felt like someone was watching me. Someone watching me would have been really hard to do too. I was about 5 miles, 8 kilometers out from civilization. No one lived in the area, and the location was kind of unremarkable and didn't attract too many hikers. Finally, the anxiety just got too much. I was meditating, and my gut feeling was screaming at me to get out of there. So I texted my sister, met her at the meeting place, walking backwards for a time, making sure I wasn't followed, etc., and got out of there. The next day I read online that some hikers in the area went missing. They were later found dead about a month later with very little decomposition. Supposedly, they looked like they were in agony. Where they were found is the spooky thing. They were about half a mile from where I was camping, slightly upriver. Plus, they never really found who or what killed them, or why they weren't eaten or really decomposed in a month that they were missing. I stopped camping in the area after that. I don't know if something was watching me or if something spooky went on, but I learned to appreciate my gut feelings after that.